In 64 CE, a naked woman staggers through the blood-soaked cobblestones of Rome, her body smeared with filth, her skin carved open by fresh lashes. Around her, a sea of thousands screams for more. Chains drag against stone as she's pulled toward the Colosseum. But what's waiting for her inside isn't just death. It's something far darker, a ritual so perverse it would haunt the human psyche for 2,000 years. By the end of this story, you'll understand why historians try to erase this chapter from history, and why some still refuse to teach it today. Because this isn't just about execution. It's about the moment Rome turned punishment into performance, and suffering into entertainment. I'm going to show you 3 things the modern world was never meant to see. First, how Rome twisted public executions into sexual theater. Second, the single crime that guaranteed this unthinkable fate. And third, why emperors themselves didn't just attend these horrors. They participated. This is the truth hidden beneath Rome's marble mask, a truth that shatters everything we thought civilization meant. So if you think you can handle humanity's darkest side, hit subscribe right now, because what comes next will forever change how you see ancient Rome. And maybe our own society. We all think we know Roman brutality, gladiators battling lions, blood spilling for glory. But that was the warm-up act. The real horror was reserved for women who dared to disobey. Picture it, the 1st to 3rd centuries CE. The Roman Empire commands half the known world. It builds monuments that still stand, legal systems still studied, philosophies still quoted. The pinnacle of civilization, they called it. But under that perfection was rot, a cold, deliberate evil the empire perfected better than anyone. Sexual humiliation as state terror. For Rome, killing was never enough. They needed fear that echoed, from the arena to every household. So public executions became theater, choreographed scenes of degradation meant to break not only the body but the soul. And what historians rarely admit is this: Rome didn't just kill women, they unmade them, stripping away their identity, their dignity, their humanity, turning their deaths into something close to pornography for the masses. This wasn't random cruelty. It was psychological warfare, perfected and repeated until humiliation itself became the sharpest weapon of the empire. And the most chilling part? The people loved it. Men, women, and children filled the arenas, cheering as the condemned were stripped, mocked, and slowly destroyed. But what came next makes even that look merciful. Imagine standing in the streets of ancient Rome. The air is thick, sweat, decay, fear. The crowd trembles with anticipation. Then the sound. Chains clanking against the stone. A woman is dragged through the forum, naked, broken, her hair matted with blood. Her crime? Maybe adultery, maybe treason, maybe simply saying no to the wrong man. Her sentence, damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. But before she faces the lions, Rome has one more act planned. The poet Martial described it, eyewitness accounts buried for centuries. Crowds hurled filth, excrement, stones, anything within reach. But that wasn't the worst part. The guards led her on a deliberate path, past temples where she once prayed, past her own home, past the markets where she used to walk freely. Why? Because Rome understood something horrifying. Destroy a person's dignity, and you erase their very existence. Martial wrote of one woman who tried to cover herself with her hands. Her fingers were broken. Another tried to fall. They forced her up, made her walk again. And here's what chills you to your bones. Families were told to attend. Parents brought their children, calling it education. Sometimes the victim's own relatives were ordered to throw stones, to prove loyalty, to avoid sharing her fate. This wasn't just cruelty, it was control. And the guards, they weren't just following orders. They weren't just guards. They were engineers of agony. Trained not in combat, but in psychological destruction. They knew exactly how long to pause at each stop in that hellish parade, how to stretch every second of humiliation until it carved itself into the victim's mind. They even studied which parts of the body, once exposed, would break the spirit fastest. But that walk through the streets, that was just foreplay. What waited inside the arena made everything before it looked like mercy. The iron gates slam shut. 50,000 Romans roar in the stands, not in fear but in excitement. To them this is sport, but this isn't about lions or gladiators. This is about turning a woman's last breath into entertainment. And here's what historians spent centuries trying to hide. Roman executions were not quick deaths. They were productions. Women were forced to reenact mythological scenes, not as art, but as public violation. Europa and the bull, Leda and the swan. Myths twisted into nightmares, but these weren't plays. They were real. Animals, trained for sexual violence, were unleashed on living women, while the crowd watched, laughed, and placed bets. The historian Cassius Dio recorded the most infamous example, Empress Messalina. Her real crime wasn't adultery, it was power. For daring to defy the emperor, she was condemned to the spectacle of shame. First, they stripped her naked before the Roman Senate. Then, crawling through the sand of the arena, she endured everything the empire had perfected over centuries. Degradation as punishment. Spectators hurled food, stones, and laughter. But that was just the beginning. Rome had a name for this, supplicium, not execution, but the ritual destruction of the human spirit before death. They brought in trained beasts, bulls, bears, even horses, conditioned to attack human flesh in ways too grotesque to imagine, and while this horror unfolded, the crowd didn't look away. They voted. Thumbs up, continue the humiliation. Thumbs down, grant mercy. But mercy rarely came. Roman mothers whispered to their daughters, teaching obedience through fear. Fathers described the screams to their sons, lessons in dominance disguised as duty. And from the emperor's private box, the best seat in the house, the ruler of the world watched his empire's power performed live in blood and tears. This wasn't punishment anymore. It was propaganda, a masterclass in terror. A warning to every Roman, challenge authority, and your body becomes the empire's message, the most haunting detail. Some of the victims were still alive when the beasts were done. The crowd would chant for more, demanding the condemned remain conscious as executioners began to dismember them, limb by limb, until silence finally fell. But even this wasn't the worst fate a woman could face in Rome. There was one punishment so cruel, so unholy that even Rome's most hardened citizens trembled at its mention. The story of the Vestal Virgins. These were Rome's most sacred women, priestesses who guarded the eternal flame that symbolized the empire's soul. They were considered untouchable, more powerful than most men, until they broke their vow of chastity. That single act turned the holy into the damned. And because Rome couldn't kill a priestess without offending the gods, they created something far worse than death. First, she was stripped naked before the Roman Senate, slowly, deliberately, as senators debated her fate. She stood there for hours, trembling, humiliated, waiting for judgment. Then came the beating. Wooden rods tore through her flesh, keeping her alive just long enough to suffer, but the real terror was still to come, as recorded by Pliny the Younger, whose letters were buried for centuries. The Vestal was taken to an underground chamber built for one purpose, to bury her alive. She was given a tiny lamp, a little bread, and a cup of water, not to save her, but to make sure she died slowly. The walls were lined with broken pottery. If she tried to claw her way out, she'd shred her hands to bone. And as the chamber was sealed, her muffled screams rose through the earth. For days, sometimes weeks, Romans gathered above ground to listen. They called it a sacred ceremony. Parents brought their children to hear the dying cries of a priestess as her light went out below. One Vestal, Pliny wrote, survived for 18 days, 18 days of darkness, hunger and madness, her own voice echoing off stone until it became her only companion. And yet, as twisted as that sounds, the empire had one more horror waiting, a fate even more disturbing than what you've just heard. If by some miracle she survived the ordeal, the priests would call it divine intervention, then execute her anyway for defiling the sacred ritual by staying alive. The emperor himself personally designed these torture chambers. He would visit the construction sites, not to oversee safety, but to test how well the walls carried screams. He called it architectural theology, using sound to prove divine justice. But here's the part that chills you to the bone. The emperors made this personal, and what I'm about to reveal next shows just how deep Roman depravity went when power became absolute. Here's the truth most historians don't dare to say. Emperors didn't just witness these rituals, they created them. They didn't just order them, they performed in them. Sexual humiliation became their form of entertainment. Emperor Caligula wasn't content to merely attend executions. He choreographed them like twisted theater. He spent weeks planning every moment of a woman's degradation, working with architects, animal trainers, and torture experts to invent new ways to make suffering look spectacular. And here's what makes your blood freeze. He invited guests. Ambassadors from Egypt, Germania, Britannia, all forced to watch as Rome showcased its genius for cruelty. It was diplomatic terrorism, performed live before the eyes of the world. Caligula even built a secret arena beneath his palace, a private laboratory of pain where he tested new torture methods on slave women before bringing them to public execution. Then came Nero. He took the nightmare further. Dressed as a gladiator, he personally assaulted condemned women before the roaring crowd. They cheered as their emperor raped prisoners to death, calling it divine justice. But the most horrifying truth: this wasn't insanity. This was policy. Sexual humiliation became Rome's weapon of diplomacy. When foreign queens defied Rome, they weren't just executed, they were degraded in front of thousands. Their shame broadcast across the empire as a warning to other rulers. The fallout was enormous. Whole civilizations rewrote their laws about women's rights just to avoid provoking Roman cruelty. Surrender treaties even included clauses protecting the dignity of captured women. Rome's sexual violence became so systematic, they created official government positions for it. There was a real title, the Magistrate of Public Degradation. It came with a salary, benefits, and unimaginable moral decay. But then, something unexpected began. Christianity spread. Slowly, whispers turned into doubt. Romans began asking themselves whether their entertainment was moral. It didn't stop overnight. These horrors continued for decades, but little by little, the crowds started vanishing. By the 4th century, emperors performed for empty seats. The executions stopped, not by royal decree, but because Romans finally lost their hunger for watching women be destroyed for pleasure. And that's the most terrifying lesson. It took 3 centuries of Christian influence to end a practice so normalized that parents once brought their children to watch it, calling it education. Rome's addiction to sexual humiliation lasted longer than gladiator fights, longer than beast hunts, longer than nearly any other spectacle. And here's the haunting final discovery. When archaeologists excavated private Roman homes, they found frescoes, paintings of these very scenes. Romans had decorated their dining rooms with images of women being tortured to death. Brutality had become domestic art. So what does this reveal about us, about civilization, about the razor-thin line between order and savagery? Rome's institutionalized sexual violence proves something terrifying. Any society can normalize the unthinkable if it benefits those in power. What we've uncovered here wasn't the madness of individuals. It was systematic, bureaucratic, approved cruelty. And here's the part that should keep you awake tonight. Public shaming still thrives today. Only the tools have changed. We use social media mobs, viral humiliation, digital persecution. The technology evolved, but the impulse remains. The Romans called it civilization while cheering for sexual torture. So what are we calling civilized today? What do we watch that future generations will call barbaric? Think about it. What forms of public humiliation have we accepted without even realizing it? I want to know what you think. Which other civilized societies use sexual humiliation as a tool of control? And more importantly, where do you still see Rome's reflection in the modern world? Drop your thoughts in the comments.